lot of what they showed people back during the 50s and 60s on television was just rife with predictive programming. And a really good example is The Twilight Zone. We've been binge watching them on Netflix lately, and they come off as total science fiction, but a lot of those were actually science fact, and people just had no idea that types of research the government and the major elite foundations like Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie were involved in during the Cold War. And a good example of that would be Season 3, Episode 31, which was called The Trade-Ins, which features an elderly couple. They go to a shop, and they're going to pick out younger bodies to have their consciousness basically transferred into, so they can basically continue on living. And that aired in 1962, and it seems like total science fiction. But in true predictive programming form, by the 70s, there were people working on that type of research, claiming that the transfer of consciousness was possible. Before I point to the exact paper that I'm referencing, I just want to say that people talk about the wealth gap, and in certain more conspiratorial circles, they mention the breakaway civilization. But one of the things that's not really talked about very often is the fact that we know not only have medical treatments and cures been largely suppressed from the public for things like cancer, go look into Royal Raymond Rife for more on that, but we get hints given to us every once in a while that this is what's going on. A good example of that would be in this March 2014 issue of Rolling Stone, where they did an interview with Bill Gates. Every once in a while, these publications do these really glowing, ass-kissy interviews with people like billionaire eugenicist Bill Gates. And he just says things that he doesn't even care what kind of eugenicist he comes off as. And this is a really good example. They start talking about healthcare reform, and the interviewer is talking about frustration with the political system and our healthcare system. And Bill Gates starts talking about the fact that there are lots of innovations that go on outside of the government. But then he actually says, but innovation can actually be your enemy in healthcare if you're not careful. And the interviewer says, how's that? And Bill Gates says, if you accelerate certain things but aren't careful about whether you want to make those innovations available to everyone, then you're intensifying the cost in such a way that you'll overwhelm all of the resources. And the interviewer says, like $1 million chemotherapy treatments, which is just a kind of outlandishly extreme example, but whatever. And Bill Gates says, yeah, or organ transplants for people in their 70s from new artificial organs being grown. There's a lot of medical technology for which, unless you can make judgments about who should buy it, you'll have to invade other government functions to find the money. There are 4 or 5 of these innovations down the pipe that are huge, huge things. And then the interviewer says, yeah, but when people start talking about these issues, we start hearing loaded phrases like death panels, etc. And then Bill Gates says, the idea that there aren't trade-offs is an outrageous thing. But what he's pointing out here is that there are innovations and medical treatments and therapies and things that they have that he funds that stuff, and other people with lots and lots of money fund that stuff, and then they keep that research totally secret from the rest of everyone else. And they do not offer it to the general public. And you'll see things about this every now and again where they've done research that shows certain psychedelics enhance IQ in animals and things like that, and they keep that stuff illegal. They've done research to take a mouse and make it smarter, give it more memory, all kinds of things like that. Reverse aging, completely reverse aging to allow humans to live to be over 90 years old easy. You hear about it once on a science blog somewhere, and then you never hear that stuff brought up again because they're never going to make that available to everybody. The people running the system already believe there are too many of us as it is and trying to get rid of people. They don't want people living longer. So this is a big club that nobody's in, as George Carlin would say, because there are medical treatments, cures, and all kinds of things that are offered to certain people, certain elite circles. They're just not given to everyone. They're just not made available to everybody. People wonder why people like David Rockefeller live to be 100 when he looks decrepit, like the blood of 1,000 babies is brimming in his eyeballs. He's horrifying. He's living to be 100. While you have average people being cut down in their 50s and 60s, and you have autoimmune diseases and cancer and autism and all these things going off the charts. And they've actually had to admit now for the first time that the overall life expectancy in this country has dropped. We're about to see that split between the haves and have-nots widen even more, and they're actually predicting that the elite are going to become a separate race of humanity altogether because they're going to have access to treatments and cures and medical technologies and all kinds of advancements that the average person is just not even going to ever know exists at all. And so you'll have a wealth gap that'll actually be more like the health gap. And it's already happening now if you look around. That having been said, what I wanted to talk about is this book here by Sir John Eccles called Mind and Brain, which is a huge focus on consciousness. Sir John Eccles being the elite Australian neurophysiologist who won the Nobel Prize with Andrew Huxley, grandson of biologist T.H. Huxley and half-brother of Brave New World author Aldous Huxley in 1963. So this is a very elite scientist, and he compiled this book with different papers from other scientists who were involved in some pretty interesting research from the 70s. I think this book was put out in, 82? But this stuff that's in it is from the 60s and 70s. And it's all about the biology of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, adaptability of your nervous system, the creation of man and the creator of man, the human brain and the human person. Free will is in here. This is a pretty creepy book, and it's not the kind of book that the average person is just going to go pick up. You're going to see people walking through the airport with, the new Danielle Steele novel and John Eccles' creepy book on the research they're doing on human consciousness. But you get down here to the bottom, and you come to Robert White and his experimental transference of consciousness, the human equivalent. This is the kind of stuff that elite scientists were working on during the Cold War and was not talked about widely in the public sphere. But this is the kind of other stuff that they were working on. And I just wanted to show you this because people always make that joke about Walt Disney cryogenically freezing his head because he thinks he's going to live forever. Well, they were actually working on that, and they're still working on it today. And elite scientists were being funded high up the chain on things like transferring human consciousness because these people ultimately want to create life, become gods, and live forever through technology. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this, not the whole thing, obviously. But it says, in recent years, we've been able to construct a series of brain models which have permitted us to literally transfer the entire brain of the experimental animal intact and still capable of high performance at all levels. And I'm just going to skip ahead, because like I said, it's very long, and get straight to the end where he just makes his point of what he's trying to say here. Thus, it is already possible to transfer human consciousness, provided the organ that subtends such functioning is retained. It could be argued that all of the other body systems and organs have been primarily developed for and in a sense subservient to the concept that brain function must be sustained and that their very existence and design is based on this principle. In other words, the body and its systems are nothing more than a power pack for the brain. From the final analysis, the brain is the tissue substrate for the mind and possibly that which we call the spirit or soul of man. Science has reached a threshold where human consciousness can be transferred, provided the organ which supervenes this characteristic is maintained. Whether research directed toward human cephalic transplantation should be undertaken requires extensive review by such fields as philosophy, theology, sociology, and medicine. So this is what they were working on in the 70s. They were working on transferring human consciousness. Robert White never gave up on this idea. He spent his whole career working on what he called prolonged hypothermic preservation and cephalic transplantation. And in the 70s, he was widely attacked in the media for doing a transplant where he took a monkey's head and put it on another monkey. And even though the monkey died in 8 or 9 days, the monkey could still use all of his primary senses, even though he was paralyzed from the neck down. See, White could never quite get the spinal cord issue worked out, but he could transplant a head onto a total, it's just like the X-Files movie, right? And in the 90s, he horrified people again when he started practicing this on cadavers. In preparation for what he said was going to be a full human head transplant, He claimed he was going to fix people like Stephen Hawking and Christopher Reeve, but they shut him down. I don't think they wanted that to be publicly known that that was something they could actually do. In 1999, he was quoted as saying, "What has always been the stuff of science fiction, the Frankenstein legend in which an entire human being is constructed by sewing various body parts together, will become a clinical reality early in the 21st century. Brain transplantation, at least initially, will really be head transplantation or body transplantation, depending on your perspective. With the significant improvements in surgical techniques and post-operative management, since then, it will now be possible to consider adapting the head transplant technique to humans." This research continues. It's not widely published. They don't really let people know they're doing it. But just a couple of years ago, a group in Italy, led by a guy named Sergio Canavero, released a paper in Surgical Neurology International on something they actually call heaven. And it looks like Walt Disney might actually get his wish, because they've been working on being able to transfer a person's head to another person. But ultimately, what they really want to do is be able to transfer the consciousness. The elite are working on living forever through technology. And you have to wonder, because this is the stuff they were working on in the 70s and the 80s. Actually, they started working on this stuff during World War II, and they've never stopped. And so these things are decades old when they're claiming they can do these kinds of things. And we have no idea what they have today, because we know that the technology they show to the public is usually decades behind the technology that's actually being perfected and worked on. And so you have to wonder, have they perfected the transference of human consciousness? Because they've only been quietly working on it for about 50 years now. So if we had a new Twilight Zone come out, would they have an episode where David Rockefeller goes into the store and picks out a young new body for his consciousness to be transferred into? Because I know it sounds crazy, but if I saw that, I would have to wonder if that's even science fiction anymore. Consciousness basically transferred into, so they can basically continue on living. And that aired in 1962, and it seems like total science fiction, but in true predictive programming form by this during the Cold War. And a good example of that would be Season 3, Episode 31, which was called The Trade-Ins, which features an elderly couple. They go to a shop, and they're going to pick out younger bodies to have their 70s. There were people working on that type of research, claiming that the transfer of consciousness was possible. Before I point to the exact paper that I'm referencing, I just total science fiction, but a lot of those were actually science fact, and people just had no idea that types of research the government and the major elite foundations like Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie were involved in. A lot of what they showed people back during the 50s and 60s on television was just rife with predictive programming. And a really good example is the Twilight Zone. We've been binge watching them on Netflix lately, and they come off as